These are actually cocoons. 6, 5, 2, I've seen as many as 20 eggs in that cocoon. And the cocoon are, oh, you can see them, but they're 2 millimeters maybe. Does anybody in here grow earthworms? Has anybody ever eaten earthworms? Y'all are not very adventurous.
Gummy worms, but not.
Well, yeah. Actually, there's a whole thing about eating earthworms. And the best use of them, they're high protein. The best use is grind them up and make flour. But they're tough. And they're actually not very clean inside. It's hard to clean an earthworm. You know how you do it? You feed them cornmeal, and that cleans them out. And earthworm burgers, I mean, there you can go on the internet and find there's a whole group of people that just make all kinds of recipes for earthworms. There's a lot of the whole evil things to eat. The good news about earthworms. The good news about earthworms. They do improve the nutritional content of the soil. Now, what's your best guess on how they do that? We call it castings in polite society. It can be contaminated with bacteria and it's got some minerals in it, and that's what we sell. It's also got nitrogen. It's a slow release nitrogen fertilizer. Asking me to answer a dumb call. And but they wasn't Lucy, huh?
If I mention he's my big brother.
Digestion.
Wow. So what we've got here is when you pick an earthworm up, they actually breathe through that material on the outside of their body. So what we've got here, they don't have any. Can get such low oxygen that they'll die, but it's not because they drowned. One of the more useful things that worms do, and there's songs about this, you know, the worms crawl in, the worms crawl in. They decompose organic matter. And without earthworms, the bacteria is going to be real slow getting after them. So the worms actually bring on the decomposition of organic matter, and that keeps the world, you know, in a cycle. They improve the soil structure. These are the ones that actually burrow through the soil and do that. And they leave little, you know, tunnels, and they chew up the dirt, and they chew up the bacteria, and they chew up the fungus. And that's another thing. And guess what? They're food for predators. So me eating earthworms, you know, but birds, you really like the birds. People don't like the worms so much, but they do like what eats the worms. And so if you change the worms, you change the predators, and you change like the songbirds and it changed skunks and things like that too, because they eat worms. Now the bad news. And this is kind of where I got going in earthworms before I even knew there was bad news. They're a non-native invasive species. There are no North American earthworms. They were all killed during the Ice Age. And our forests and all came back without worms. And they're attuned to to, thriving without worms. And I'm a forester. And so that was a shock to me. Worms damage the forest. They eat the mold, the kind of things that make the forests are a fungal kind of biome. Fields are microbial, and so if you take the fungus out of the forest, then the trees and things can't communicate with each other. And people really didn't understand that until maybe 30 or 40 years ago, that the trees communicate through a fungal network and the worms were eating it. They leave waste products on your lawn. They don't, they just like any other pet you'd have, they leave what they digest on your lawn. And although you want them in your garden, there are people that don't want that on their lawn. And the people that really don't want that on their lawn are people that paid a whole lot for a beautiful lawn and some kind of little short grass or something like that. And then here's a worm mound in the middle. And golf courses, my goodness, they poison worms. I'm not much of a poison person. They're an invasive species. Now here is a picture of a forest before the earthworms got there. Here's the forest after the earthworms got there. It's dramatic and it's quick. It's usually about a 2-year period of time. A worm can take that forest down. And when you lose the undergrowth, then you have erosion and you have a lot of animals and things don't have anything to eat, but the worms have already eaten it. And, so that's the bad side of earthworms. You really have to be attentive if you're going to use worms for what you're wanting to make a good soil. This is kind of against what nature's doing. And so you have to take care of making sure you don't let the worms loose. A lot fishers or people that go fishing are worse than farmers are, but because they just dump the worms out in the woods and then the worms propagate, and that's it leads to a forest that looks like that. Now, I was a worm wrangler. When I got started, I built worm beds, and my competitive advantage was I had a nice poplar forest, and that was cool in the summertime. And so I had these 4x8 beds full of worms, and I was making worm castings and going great guns. And a tornado came through and tore down my forest, and 1 million worms escaped. Now I had them barcoded and named, of course. But when I first started, the worms don't have a full digestive system. They have to have compost. It's got the microbes in the compost are half of their digestive system. Well, they're also cold-blooded animals. That's, this cold-blooded. No, that's kind of a sad thing to say. They're cold-blooded, so their body is the temperature of their environment. Compost generates heat. And so if you put worms in your compost, if you're doing a composting thing, you need to monitor the heat. You want your compost to get maybe 140 degrees, or, so that you can kill the pathogens. But you can't put worms in it at that temperature. So the compost has to be mature enough that it's down, in the, not above 117. But, so the compost has to be mature before you put the worms in. Mine wasn't. I put my worms in, and the worms are, they're allergic to light, but they'd rather come out in the light than stay in that hot compost bed. So what we did, we got all the lights in the house and put out over the bed to drive the worms back into the compost bed. So it looked like an aircraft landing field out there. And there were all the lights in the house out there getting my worms to go back into bed. And they did, and so I still had worms.
We talked about that a lot.
There's medicine. And worms are truly sexually liberated. You know that if two little worms meet up and one little worm gets pregnant, two little worms get pregnant because they're hermaphrodites. And the little cocoons that's in that purple thing around the worm's body, that contains whatever happened, in their night out. And the cocoons may have, I hardly found more than 5 or 6 eggs. But you can take and gather the worm eggs and put them in a new bed, and you can generate a new worm colony. And when I started doing this, the myth was that worms would not change what they ate. So if they started in this particular compost thing, the baby worms would stay with what they ate, but the adult worms, if you change the mix, would stop eating. And there were a lot of things that were said about that. A lot, we humanize a lot. The mama worms were starving themselves to death. That's a bunch of stuff. All right. So there are myths like that. The myth was the worms would have to have the same kind of fare that they had when they first started eating. And that turns out not to be true. They're really more like teenage girls, as I say here. If it's not on their menu for the day, then they're just not going to eat it. Now, what I did is I gathered food from the Second Harvest and places like that was being thrown out, and I ran it through a big hammer mill that we used to make for cow feed with, and then I had this circular thing about 10 feet wide where I made my compost in a circular bin with a big black plastic hose in the middle of it, and I could get enough heat out of that compost pile. It was a donut shape, the idea that you don't want to be more than 2 feet from air. And so a donut, you can have inside and outside, and I had a nice thing going there. You could heat the house with that water, but it didn't last long enough. So the compost would only make enough heat to, for maybe 90 days or something like that. Then you'd have to build a new pile. It's easier to cut wood, put in the so the mama worms were not starving themselves, because they were taking care of the baby worms. They were just being obstinate, as far as we can tell. And some people think you can cut a worm in half. Well, you can, but you don't get two worms. You get a short worm and an oval tail. But they can regenerate their tails, just like lizards. Does any of this stuff make any sense to y'all? All right. Now, worms that live underground actually live in 3 layers. They come to the top to excrete. The next layer down, they eat. And the bottom layer is their bedroom section. And so if you have the kind of worms that burrow, that's not very effective when you try to make them compost for you, because you tear the house down every time you go to gather your worm castings. So get the right kind of worms. Night crawlers is what I was trying to get out about 10 minutes ago, and I couldn't remember what kind of worms I was talking about. You see the night crawlers crawling out of your yard, or after a rain, or if you overwater your yard. And scientists really don't know why that's happening. You can, people are spinning more and more yarns about why that's happening. But at first they thought the worms are trying to keep from drowning, but they don't have lungs. They're not going to drown. They can live in water for 2 months, as long as there's oxygen in the water. Just like fish, they need less oxygen than fish actually. Then the worms will live. But I was going to do on the next one. If you overwater the lawn, or if it's a heavy rainfall, what seems to be happening is that worms have to be lubricated on the outside to crawl through the dirt. And they're get a better dose of lubrication. Actually, the fresh rain is oxygen rich, and they may be on an oxygen high. And they can certainly move faster than they could before it rained. So they're still investigating, or somebody's trying to think up a viable theory of why the worms are crawling out of the ground during a rainstorm. So go into research. You won't get a Nobel Prize, but it will be fun. You burn up the internet. There's a problem. Earthworms leave little piles of dirt and worm poop whenever they do their daily duty, and that's obnoxious, especially if you've got a nice lawn. There's a solution. Fertilize the lawn with worm castings. See, worms can't live in their own castings. So if you fertilize, and it's good for the grass, the lawn with worm castings, then you won't have worms, and they won't put divots on your lawn. That was a good market for worm castings when I was in that business. The other thing, the best market was people that grew show roses, because nematodes, which are worms, attack the roots of the roses. And if you fertilize with the worm castings, the nematodes won't come to the roots of the roses. And I had a little route that I would just, take. I was getting like $8 a pound for worm castings. You can't get that for beef on the hoof, Well, it probably costs a lot more now, but it is heavy work, because a pound is still a pound. And when it gets to be 100 pounds, it's still 100 pounds. And so, I shy away from the hard work. So I kind of got out of the worm business. Now I've got pictures of worms. Do y'all ever look at worms, or Do you know what they look like? Well, here's a common worm, and all of these are invasive worms. They've been brought to America or to North American continent from Europe and from Asia. Some of it deliberately and some of it accidentally. But so the first species, you know, these look like the kind of worms that are making the soil more friable. And then here's the common earthworm. And you see the little, this is where the little cocoons are kept. And this just slides off the end of the worm like a snake sheds its skin. But it just slides off the end of the worm when it's the cocoon's ready to go. And if you think worms are red, then I brought in a green one. These are more common in UK. In fact, this is probably the most common earthworm in UK is this little green worm. And night crawlers are good for fishing. This is a good composting worm. It's also a top, a liver. Liver's some inside some worms that live on top of the soil. This brambling worm is a interesting beast because it has a very foul smell. But so, if you think it's just an earthworm and you pick it up, you'll wish you hadn't. It's not as bad as a skunk. Now, I couldn't get away without at least a picture of a giant earthworm. And here it's coiled up. And but the one I saw was as long as two of these tables together and about that big around. And they don't have teeth, so don't worry. With our giant earthworms on this continent are in Washington State. Now, they haven't seen this worm maybe in 30 years, but so they think it's extinct. But it was around during the 1800s. And then this is another nice little worm that really does soil for fragmenting. And you got to have your African night crawlers. We can read on and on about the characteristics of the worms, but they all just doing one of two things. They're either making fragment in the soil or they're putting a little extra nitrogen in it. And this is the kind of worms that if you are going to start a composting thing, make sure you've got these worms instead of the night crawlers and the earthworms, because these worms, and they will eat their body weight every 2 days. So if you have a pound of worms, in 2 days, you'll have a pound of worm castings. And that's the production side of it. All right. And army worms, they're bugs. They're insects. They're the larvae of insects. So the armyworm is really the juvenile state of that moth. Now, that doesn't say that they don't do as much damage, but they do a different kind of damage than the earthworms. And that's about, the top end of what I've got to say.
Do you have questions?
You may ask a question. Is anybody going to answer it?
See, I'll make that. So one of my questions, I think this is my big question, is my soil here is pretty poor.
Mhm.
And I I've been adding compost to it. My compost does not generally have worms in it because I use a bin. What can I do to introduce worms in my bed so that they will
Well, actually,
incorporate the
you could do the worms in a compost bin, because if you put composting worms out in your garden, they'll die. Because they live under the leaves and things like that. So those aren't the kind of worms that are going to make the soil friable. They are the kind of that will break down the compost materials, and then you put the compost out here. What kind of happened to my worm casting business is pure worm castings are really good about keeping divots down on golf courses and about fertilizing roses. But people found out, well, you could cut them half and half with a good black compost. And compost is not worm castings. And so it didn't repel the bugs and the worms like the true stuff did. And
so what do I do to my soil to get the
well, if you really,
compost?
I'm a no-till person. And the reason I am is that the microbiome and the fungal systems are torn up when you till. When there's no soil in East Tennessee. If you say soil, you need to go to the Midwest. And then you saw what they did. They tilled it up and it all blew away. And that's what got the USDA, these people started understanding. Now, there's no such thing as no-till. You can't do a no. So what you're really doing to be effective is your top dressing. So you top dress, and all soil is made from the top. That you churn it up and get something down there. Now, it's not valid because it's not long lasting. It lasts 2 or 3 years, and then what you've done is it compacts so bad. So what you want to do is top dress, and then you just punch a hole where you want to put a seed. It takes about 3 or 4 years to get a piece of land to work if you top dress
So I've been doing that for about 5 years.
it. Mm-hmm.
And my soil is still.
What do you?
Plants grow, but they don't thrive.
Mm-hmm.
And so, and I've been.
Did you think about maybe going into rock quarrying?
Yeah, I could do that pretty easy. Yeah, I grow potato rocks.
But
So it's just the nature of the soil here. I'm not gonna ever have that rich loamy.
that's right. It's the nature of the soil here. We don't have the soil that you
Midwest.
and they've wasted theirs. Now, the best we can do, or what seems to be a thing, is top dress and don't turn the soil. But yeah, and I use cardboard and things like that as to keep it from to keep weeds down. First place, I don't believe in weeds. Weeds are somebody's vegetable that is not being used anymore. And my favorite greens are pigweed. Do you know what pigweed is? It's amaranth. And in the spring, it's the most delicate. It's better than lettuce. It's got a little bit of a minty flavor, and it's tender. But what we don't do correctly about what we're calling weeds is we don't know when to pick them. And if we get our schedule and took care of what was growing in our yard, we could probably feed ourselves. But we have to pick it at the right time, because really, real old dandelions are pretty bitter. But fresh, a schedule of when to pick what's growing is that's one thing that I didn't get from my Aunt Leota. My Aunt Leota knew what to eat, and but she forgot to tell us when to pick it. And so I'm into trying to figure that out.
So
Yes,
the
ma'am.
earthworms in for Donna's, you say top dress, do you put the earthworms in the top dressing?
You
to-
put the earthworms someplace else where they can live and then take the compost.
You take the cast, how do you gather the cast?
Well, in a compost worm, it's difficult. But if you use like the earthworms that build multi-layer habitats, then they're on top. You just take the top layer.
Castings on
Yeah.
top.
And, you know, they're what the golf course, you know, the little divots, you've seen.
Yeah.
And so the castings would be on top.
So if she took the castings and put it on top of her top dressing, would that?
You
What-
can ask top dressing.
I would say, I would top dress with it and use the compost as the top dressing. And you might be, getting an inch of dirt or soil a year, and then you should, but don't turn it. Because you lose it when you turn it. And then all the nutrients in soil go down. Nothing's coming back up.
So one of my observations is that, you put this beautiful compost, you top dress it,
Mm-hmm.
and then you have one of these massive rainstorms. And a
Mhm.
lot of that washing,
Yeah.
because even if you use the cardboard and put mulch on top of it,
Mhm.
you just can't.
And so the garden can't look like what you're used to a garden looking like. And I was messing with permaculture for a while. But when I found out that there's no real scientific basis to permaculture, then I decided to go back to school. And that's what I decided to, go to UT, and they know that. And the myths that we deal with, the idea that you can send a tablespoon of dirt to Nashville and find out how to fertilize your lawn, that's a miracle. And in fact, it is a miracle if that happens. Because, and then what's the hope is that we have technology now that let us micro fertilize. I've got a little gadget where I can, I've got a couple of these GPS devices. I put one in a place and let it sit there for about a week. And it communicates with 30 satellites. And it knows where it is. And it knows how high, it knows the elevation, it knows the latitude and longitude. And then I've got the other one that I take out on the farm, and I just interrogate that. And I can get an answer within the size of a dime in about 30 seconds. I know the elevation, I know the X and Y coordinates, and so I really know where things are. And with that ability to know where things are, then you need the soil sample. And I took this soil, the university course, and they figured this out in 1970. They knew that the teaspoon of dirt was only making money for the fertilizer company. But you can't, it's politically connected. And so my professor can't stand up and say this. Or they'll, let him find another job. Well, since I'm not, highly paid for this, I can go ahead and speak my mind. But we will have things that let us micro analyze the nutrient, value of the field. Now, one time before I found out work was really hard, it makes me tired. I was growing tomatoes for Barry Litton's restaurant. And so I had these raised bed things, and I covered them and I watered them. And I put a tablespoon of Miracle Grow would give me 400 pounds of tomatoes. I dissolved it in the water, had a soil watering system, and I measured what was taken out of the system, and I put that back instead of just going